Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. We're going to rewind things back to the early days of true crime podcasting.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we're going to be checking out an episode of My Favorite Murder
Cool.
from way back in January of 2016.
Wow.
So this is episode 3.
Episode 3.
Yeah, they actually revisited it later to give us
Awesome.
some updates and share how their views have changed over the years, which is,
Oh, very cool.
yeah. So it'll be interesting to see how things have evolved. So to set the scene, Karen and Georgia start this episode talking about a big story that broke that year in 2016
Okay.
about FBI hair analysis and how it was flawed.
Oh, wow.
This wasn't just like a small mistake.
Right.
It really shook the foundations of forensic science.
Yeah, I remember when that happened.
Yeah, they actually found that flawed testimony from FBI examiners was present in 95% of the 268 trials that they reviewed.
95%.
Yeah.
So almost every case.
Yeah.
That's a little terrifying.
It's very terrifying, especially when you think about all those shows we've watched,
Right.
like Forensic Files and all that.
Where they presented it as
Yeah,
like a slam dunk.
yeah,
So that's a little scary. It makes
Yeah.
you kind of question everything.
definitely.
You thought you knew about forensic science, and hair analysis wasn't the only method under scrutiny.
Oh, really?
Yeah, blood spatter analysis was also being reevaluated.
Hmm.
So it was,
So like that whole magic talk,
yeah,
the idea that science is going to give you the answer
right.
just started to crumble a little bit.
Absolutely. And that sets the stage for the two cases that Karen and Georgia discussed in this episode, both of which really raise some serious questions about the reliability of evidence and the potential for wrongful convictions.
Okay, so let's dive into the first case.
Okay.
Karen's favorite murder, which is the case of Cameron Todd Willingham.
I've heard of this one.
Yeah, so Willingham was convicted and then executed in Texas in 1991
Okay.
for the arson deaths of his 3 daughters.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and Karen even talks about how this case really haunts her. She thinks about Willingham at least once a month.
I can see why.
Yeah.
It's
It's,
a tough one.
yeah.
Yeah.
The investigation really relied heavily on what we now know are outdated and unreliable arson investigation techniques.
Right.
And there's evidence suggesting that the fire may have been accidental and possibly caused by a space heater.
Oh, wow.
And on top of that, Willingham's behavior during the fire was interpreted in very different ways.
Okay.
So some witnesses said he was distraught, while others, whose stories changed over time,
Oh.
claimed that he seemed unemotional.
Oh, so you don't know.
Yeah, and it's almost as if people saw what they wanted to see,
Right.
potentially influenced by Willingham having an Iron Maiden poster and a tattoo
Ah.
that some considered satanic, which is
That's interesting how those societal biases really creep in.
right.
Maybe consciously, maybe unconsciously.
Yeah, and it really can lead to injustice.
Definitely. I mean, think about how it happens even today. Yeah, certain types of clothing or even music can be used to paint somebody in a negative light, especially in court.
Right.
So yeah, that's really interesting how assumptions can really cloud judgment.
It's a little scary.
Yeah, for sure.
And then there's also the issue of the jailhouse informant who testified against Willingham.
Oh, the jailhouse informant, those are always so
Yeah.
interesting.
So for those who don't know, a jailhouse informant is somebody who claims to have heard the accused confess to a crime
Right,
while they were in jail together.
right.
And their testimony can be really powerful,
Yeah.
but it's also super unreliable
Yeah,
because a lot of times they have ulterior motives.
right. They want a shorter sentence
Yeah.
or something like that,
Right. So their stories really have to be taken with a grain of salt.
for sure.
And in Willingham's case, the informant later admitted that he had been incentivized to testify.
Oh, wow.
So you've got the potentially flawed science,
Yeah.
you've got conflicting eyewitness accounts,
Mm-hmm.
and you've got a questionable informant. Yeah, that's not good.
Not a good mix.
Not a good mix.
And sadly, that's what happened here. Even with updates in 2014 and 2017, where the prosecutor was accused of misconduct but ultimately found not guilty,
Oh,
there's still a big cloud of doubt over this case.
Yeah.
And then to add another layer, William's wife actually wavered on whether she believed he was guilty.
oh wow.
Yeah. So it's just a really unsettling case with no easy answers. And Karen and Georgia actually recommend the 2010 documentary Death by Fire if anyone wants to learn more.
Oh, I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, it's really good. So let's shift gears now and talk about Georgia's favorite murder, which is a case that's just as disturbing, but for very different reasons. And that is the unsolved Oakland County child killings in Michigan.
I've heard of that one too.
Yeah, this one took place between 1976 and 1977.
Okay.
And it's really hard to even talk about, but we're talking about 4 children, all between the ages of 11 and 12,
Oh, gosh.
who were abducted and murdered.
Wow.
And the killer was never caught.
Oh, my gosh. Yeah. And what makes this case really chilling are the details of the crimes.
Okay.
So some of the victims were raped,
Oh, gosh.
but others were bathed and fed before being killed.
What?
Yeah, so it's like
That's
this
so disturbing.
bizarre mix of care and cruelty,
Right.
which is just so disturbing.
Yeah.
And there's this one really gut-wrenching detail that Georgia shares,
Okay.
where the parents of one of the victims, Timothy King, went on TV
Yeah.
pleading for his return and promising him his favorite meal, which was KFC.
Oh, no.
And then his body was found the next day
Oh, gosh.
with KFC in his stomach.
Oh, that's awful.
It's just heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And this juxtaposition of the perceived care
Right.
with the horrible reality of the crimes is what led to the killer being called the babysitter killer, which is just
Chilling.
very chilling.
Yeah.
So one of the main suspects was a 24-year-old wealthy young man named Christopher Bush.
Okay.
And he had a history of child molestation allegations. And investigators found what we now call child sexual abuse material
Right.
in his room, along with a possible drawing of one of the victims.
Okay, so they had their guy.
You would think,
Yeah.
but
Mm.
this is where things get really dark.
Oh, no.
So the investigation into Bush revealed that he was connected to a pedophile ring
Oh, wow.
that was operating under the guise of a Christian boys' camp
Oh, my gosh.
on an island called North Fox Island.
What?
Yeah.
A whole island dedicated to that.
Yeah, it was a remote island in Lake Michigan.
Oh, my goodness.
And it gets worse.
What? How could it get worse?
The only way to get on and off the island was by plane.
Oh, my gosh.
So these kids were essentially trapped,
Oh.
completely at the mercy of these predators.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, so Bush was connected to this island, but he was never actually charged.
Oh, wow.
And that's part of what makes this case so frustrating.
Yeah.
Another suspect emerged named Ted Lamborine,
Okay.
who was also linked to the pedophile ring, on North Fox Island. And a prisoner in an unrelated case actually identified Lamborine as someone who had bragged about killing kids in Oakland County.
Oh, wow. So did they get him?
No.
Oh, my gosh.
There was a lot of circumstantial evidence pointing to Lamborine,
Okay.
like the fact that the murder stopped when he moved to Cleveland.
Ah.
And there were suspicions that he may have even confessed to a priest. But despite all of this, there wasn't enough solid evidence to actually charge him with the Oakland County murders.
Oh, that's so frustrating.
So frustrating.
All these suspects, all these disturbing details,
Yeah.
no convictions.
Yeah. And you can imagine how frustrating it was for the families of the victim,
I can't even imagine.
especially for Barry King, who was Timothy's father.
Right.
He dedicated his life to seeking justice for his son
Yeah.
and the other victims, but he sadly died in 2020 without ever getting those answers.
Oh, my gosh.
The case remains open, and there's still a tip line if anyone has any information. And Karen in Georgia recommend the 2018 podcast, Don't Talk to Strangers If You Want to Learn More.
Okay.
Really delves deep into the case.
Yeah, it's just tragic that after all these years,
Yeah.
there's still no resolution.
Right.
And, going back to this case for Georgia, it must have been really tough,
Yeah.
especially given her own reflection on the language that was used back then.
You're right. Georgia actually talks about how she used outdated terminology
Yeah.
for child sexual abuse material
Yeah.
in this early episode.
Right.
And it really shows how much our awareness and our sensitivity
Yeah.
to these issues has evolved,
Yeah.
even in just the past few years.
That's true.
It's a good reminder that we all have to be constantly learning
Yes.
and adapting, especially when we're talking about such sensitive topics.
Absolutely. And, that kind of brings us to Karen and Georgia's reflections on their own podcasting style in those early days. They were a lot more casual and lighthearted back then, partly because they didn't realize they had such a large audience.
Right.
It's fascinating to see how their approach has matured alongside the growth of the true crime genre itself.
It really has.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered some pretty heavy stuff so far.
Yeah, we have.
We've seen how flawed forensic science can lead to devastating consequences, and the search for justice can be really long and inconclusive.
Right.
But there's still a lot more to uncover
Oh, yeah.
as we look at how Karen and George's views and approaches have evolved.
Right.
And that's where we're going to be diving into in the next part of our deep dive.
Looking forward to it.
Stay tuned.
All right.
So we're back, and it's just amazing to see how much My Favorite Murder has evolved since those early episodes.
Yeah.
Like, Karen and Georgia even joke about how different their approach was
Right.
back then.
Yeah.
It was like they were just two friends
Yeah.
chatting about true crime
Right.
without a care in the world.
It really was that casual,
Yeah.
almost off-the-cuff approach that drew listeners in.
Yeah.
You know, they weren't trying to be experts. They weren't trying to deliver this polished lecture.
Yeah.
They were just sharing their genuine fascination with these cases.
Right. And sometimes their dark humor about it all.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you could tell they were still kind of figuring things out, even with something as simple as episode titles.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Back then, they were mostly using like number puns,
Oh.
like episode 3, the Thrilogy,
Okay.
or something like that.
Right.
But as their audience grew,
Hmm.
their titles got a lot more creative.
Yeah.
And they would often incorporate like inside jokes or funny quotes from the episode itself,
Okay.
which is a subtle change,
Yeah.
but it shows that they were more aware of their audience and trying to connect with them on a more personal level.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, they even joke about some alternative titles for this episode,
Oh, yeah.
like Walking Miracle
Uh-huh.
and Magic Talk,
Oh, I like that.
which I think really captures the vibe of that era.
Yeah.
Walking Miracle is so relatable. We've all had those moments where you look back on your childhood and think, how did I survive that?
Right.
Right? And it speaks to that shared experience of growing up in a time when safety wasn't always the top priority.
Yeah, that's true.
And Magic Talk really highlights their skepticism
Yeah.
about the so-called infallibility of forensic science.
Yeah.
Like, they're saying, don't just blindly believe what you're told,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to evidence.
Right. Question everything.
Yeah.
Be critical.
Yeah. Yeah.
That critical thinking, that questioning of authority
Yeah.
has always been at the core of their show.
Yeah.
Even back then,
Mm-hmm.
you know, they want their listeners to be active participants in these conversations.
Right.
And not just passive consumers of information.
Right. It's about engaging
Yeah, exactly.
with the material.
Yeah.
And it's interesting how they managed to maintain that playful conversational tone
Uh-huh.
while still addressing these serious and sensitive topics.
Yeah, that's a real skill.
Yeah.
They know how to create a space where people feel comfortable engaging
Right.
with these complex issues
Yeah.
without feeling overwhelmed or lectured to.
Right. It's like they're inviting you into their living room
Yeah.
for a chat.
Yeah, even when they're talking about murder.
Right.
It's great.
And in this rewind episode, they take it a step further
Okay.
by actually acknowledging their own growth and evolution,
Mm-hmm.
especially when it comes to how they talk about sensitive subjects
Yeah.
like child sexual abuse.
Right.
George's reflection on her use of outdated terminology for child sexual abuse material
Yeah.
is a really important moment
It is.
in the episode.
Uh-huh.
She owns up to her mistake
Yeah.
and recognizes that the language we use matters.
Yes, especially when talking about vulnerable victims.
Absolutely.
So it's great that she does that. It
Yeah.
shows a willingness to learn
Yeah.
and adapt,
Right.
which I think is essential
Mhm.
for anyone in the public eye.
Absolutely.
You know, it's not about being perfect.
Right.
It's about being open to feedback
Yeah.
and striving to do better.
Absolutely.
And it also highlights the dynamic nature of true crime.
Mm-hmm.
It's not this static genre where the facts are set in stone.
Right.
Our understanding of these cases,
Mhm.
the laws surrounding them,
Yeah.
even the language we use to discuss them is constantly evolving.
It's true.
It's constantly changing.
It's a reminder that true crime isn't just about rehashing old cases.
Right.
It's about engaging in this ongoing conversation
Yeah.
about justice and ethics and the complexities of human behavior.
It's fascinating.
It is.
It really is.
All right. So welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into My Favorite Murder. As we wrap up this look back at this episode from 2016.
Yeah.
You know, it's been really interesting to hear Karen and Georgia reflect on those early days and to see how they've grown,
Right?
not just as podcasters, but also as individuals.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, and it's really cool that they're not afraid to kind of admit their past missteps,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to language and sensitivity.
Yeah. They really use this rewind as an opportunity to show how their perspectives have evolved,
Right.
which I think is really valuable for their listeners.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Like, remember how Georgia talked about using that outdated terminology
Uh-huh.
for child sexual abuse material?
Yeah.
It's a good reminder that language is always evolving.
Always changing.
Yeah. And we all have a responsibility to stay informed
Right.
and use language that is respectful and accurate.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, it's a perfect example of how this Rewind episode
Mm-hmm.
goes beyond just revisiting those old cases.
Yeah.
It's a reflection on their own growth
Right.
and a conversation about how societal awareness
Right.
has shifted, even in a relatively short amount of time.
Absolutely. And it makes you realize that, even Karen and Georgia,
Yeah.
with all their success, are still learning
Yeah.
and growing just like the rest of us.
Absolutely. We should all be doing that.
Yeah, they don't present themselves as having all the answers,
Right.
which I think makes them so relatable.
Yeah, definitely.
Their willingness to be vulnerable and admit their mistakes
Mm-hmm.
is not something you always see,
No.
especially in true crime,
Right.
where there could be a tendency to really focus on
The facts.
the facts and the evidence.
Yeah, it's just the case itself.
Yeah.
But not so much the human element.
Yeah, it's very refreshing
Yeah.
to see that.
Yeah, for sure.
Like you feel like you're a part of the conversation,
Absolutely.
like you're learning and growing along with them.
Yeah, and that sense of connection
Yeah.
is what makes their podcast so powerful.
Yeah.
They've created this incredible community
Yeah.
where people can engage with these often difficult topics
Mhm.
in a way that feels really safe and supportive.
Right.
So it's
Cool.
great.
Yeah, and speaking of difficult topics,
Yeah.
We can't ignore the fact that both the Willingham case and the Oakland County child killings
Right.
really raise some serious questions
Uh-huh.
about the justice system.
Absolutely. They both highlight the potential for flawed investigations,
Right.
the influence of bias,
Mm-hmm.
and the devastating consequences of wrongful convictions.
Yeah, and even though these cases are from different eras
Right.
and they involve different types of crimes,
Yeah.
they both really underscore that need for constant vigilance
Yes.
and reform within the justice system.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that justice is an ongoing process,
Right.
not a destination.
It's a journey.
Yeah. And that we all have a role to play
Mm-hmm.
in ensuring that our systems are fair
Yeah,
and equitable and truly serve the cause of justice.
right. And it's so easy to get caught up
Uh-huh.
in all the details of these cases.
Right.
The evidence and the suspects and the twists and turns.
All the drama.
Yeah, but ultimately it's the human stories that stay with you. The victims and their families and the ripple effects of these crimes on entire communities.
And that's something that Karen and Georgia always do so well. They
Yeah.
bring those human stories
Yeah.
to the forefront.
Right.
They remind us that behind the headlines
Mm.
and the court transcripts,
Yeah,
there are real people whose lives have been profoundly impacted by these events.
absolutely.
It's so important to remember that.
Yeah. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the biggest takeaway
Yeah.
is that true crime, when approached with respect and awareness, can be so much more
Yes.
than just entertainment.
Absolutely.
They can be a catalyst for reflection,
Yeah.
for growth, and for a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So yeah, it's about moving beyond sensationalism and embracing the complexities and the nuances and the human stories that are at the heart of these cases.
Exactly.
It's about asking those tough questions,
Yeah.
challenging assumptions, and using our fascination with true crime
Uh-huh.
to advocate for a more just and compassionate world.
Absolutely. And as Karen and Georgia have shown us,
Mm-hmm.
it's about being open to learning,
Yeah.
evolving, and using our voices
Right.
to create positive change.
So the next time you find yourself engrossed in a true crime podcast or documentary,
Yeah.
take a moment to think about the bigger picture.
Yeah.
What does this case teach us about ourselves, about our society, about the systems we live in?
And how can we use this knowledge to create a world where justice prevails
Yeah.
and empathy guides our actions?
Well, thank you so much for joining us
Yeah.
on this journey back to 2016 with my favorite murder.
This has been fun.
I'm glad you think so.
Yeah.
I hope this deep dive has given you some new insights into the evolution of true crime and the power of this genre to spark these important conversations.
Me too.
So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.